people of Earth, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. I, of course, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And people of Earth, you may not be aware of it, but you are, in fact, trashing your planet with consequences that are already devastating and could be that much more so. That topic is very much at the heart of my next guest's latest article, and she's been on the program before. We are delighted to have her back. Sarah Lazare is and Sarah, if it's Lazare or Lazare, I can't remember. Correct me when I'm done. But Sarah Lazare, Lazare, is a writer and a reporter at In These Times, as well as the web editor there. She is also a co-author with her late father of the book Testimony, which we'll get to in a minute. But the immediate topic is Sarah's recent article, Instead of a War on Terror, imagine if we spent the last 20 years fighting climate change. And she joins us now. So first of all, Sarah, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And is it Lazare or Lazare? I have a feeling it's Lazare after I said Lazare.
It's Lazare.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay. The teachers always mispronounce my name in elementary school, even though it's pronounced phonetically. So I'm very sensitive to name mispronunciations. So, in the best way, Sarah, when I read this piece, even the headline alone, yeah, of course, right? I mean, the headline you get when somebody says something that's so obvious it's critically important, and yet if it's so obvious, why didn't somebody else say it first? You get what I'm saying? I mean, it almost sounds like a diss, and it's the exact opposite. It's when something is really important, fundamental, sometimes it sounds obvious, but like, I didn't think to write it. So why don't we start with that? You point out, we've talked about it on this program, recent report that the U.S. has spent since 9/11 $21 trillion on military-related issues, and I believe that is the taking off point for your piece, right?
Yeah. So the $21 trillion relates to foreign and domestic militarization. This is obviously a tremendous sum. Sometimes I bristle a little bit when we talk about military spending as being really expensive. And I do that for a few reasons. One is that being expensive isn't bad in itself. Like if you're spending a lot of money on genuine social good that care for people's lives instead of taking lives, that's great. And then two, the harm of the military, first and foremost, is the lives that have been taken, the bombs that have been dropped, the people all over the world who are caught in the crosshairs of U.S. empire. And that should be our first concern.
Right.
But the reason that looking at military and militarized spending is helpful is because it says something about the moral priorities of our society and where they're placed. And if you look at what could have been done with this money instead, that's incredibly tragic. So, so the National Priorities Project, which is a great research organization, noted that for a sum of $1.7 trillion, you could eliminate all student debt. $200 billion could cover 10 years of free preschool for all 3- and 4-year-olds in the country. But then most crucially for our purposes, $4.5 trillion could cover the full cost of decarbonizing the US electric grid. And the reason that this framing is really important is because I'm sure it's not news to anyone that we are now fully in the grips of a climate crisis. There is no denying the climate crisis is on our shores. Hurricane Ida saw terrifying flooding, saw lives lost, saw power cut off to people in major cities, like New Orleans. And it's not too late to ward off the worst case scenario. The recent IPCC report showed us that while a certain amount of climate change is locked in, there's a big difference between the worst case scenario and the best case scenario from here. So it's not too late to ward off the worst case scenario. However, the last 20 years were really the time that we should have been all hands on deck tackling climate change. But instead, the US was all hands on deck fighting a horrible war against some vague enemy out there, doing harm across the planet when really the enemy was right here. The enemy is, CEOs of oil companies. The enemies are politicians who are beholden to those CEOs, yet we haven't been doing battle with them.
Yeah,
and I'm not. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I just wanted to make a couple points about what you said and maybe probe them a little further. Number one, absolutely, spending money per se is not a bad thing, despite the Washington consensus that it is, unless it's military. But we had Lindsay Kashkarian on last week, who was the principal author of that report we're talking about, the 21 trillion. And she made the great point that you're reiterating, that it's not just the expenditure. It's A, what the expenditure says about our values and our society, and B, how that expenditure has changed our values in society. And then, of course, the victims of that expenditure, which are enormous, and to which, you implicitly added the victims of our not focusing our attention, financial and socially and politically and every other way, on the real villains of the piece, so to speak. And I would only add to that, for example, not only the tremendous devastation caused by in Louisiana, not only the deaths from and destruction from the wildfires we've seen around this country and of course around the world, but add to that, studies that show 250,000 deaths per year related to environmental conditions in this country that we don't carefully track, but they may be asthma deaths, they may be cancer deaths, but so there's an enormous death toll. We had a single death toll of 3,000, terrible as that was, on 9/11. We've had a much more massive death toll from the climate. Our reaction to 9/11 has been counterproductive, not productive. And so in essence, what you're really imagining in this piece, or contrasting, is we've been chasing shadows, is the way I would put it, while the house is on fire. And I think it's a tremendous point. I don't know if you agree with everything I've said, but I think the point you're making is very important.
Yeah, I do agree. And, you bring up an important point because it's these counterfactuals are tough because we don't know what the last 20 years could have looked like otherwise. However, there are some indications that the war on terror really set us back, not just because of the direct harm it was doing, but also because it sucked up all of the oxygen and bolstered right-wing ways of seeing the world at a time that we really needed a big turn to the left. And one of the things that I always think about is the global justice movement of the late 90s and early 2000s, the movement that took on the World Trade Organization, that protested sort of global capital and these institutions that defend it, like the IMF and World Bank. That movement was talking about climate change in the late 90s. The call to action for the Seattle WTO protests in 1999 mentioned the issue of global warming in the very first line of the call to action. However, after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when we saw this big national buildup towards war, a few things happened. One of those things was that the global justice movement, by necessity, had to turn into an anti-war movement because all of a sudden there was this need to sort of try to stop a horrific thing from happening. But then another thing we saw is that post 9/11, measures like the Patriot Act were actually used to repress the global justice movement. But also, we just saw this general turn towards the right, this real jingoism, this idea of all hands on deck to defend the homeland, and a bevy of racist and just right-wing sentiments and policies that went along with that. And that's horrible because that was a time that we really needed to be fostering left-wing solutions to this global climate crisis. And it's hard to know where that global justice movement could have taken us if it wasn't forced to sort of be on the defensive against a big, horrible war. And, you know, I want to be careful here because I definitely want to steer away from nihilism or from this idea that, oh, we missed our chance and now we're all doomed, because that's really not the case. There's still, the IPCC report was very, very clear that dramatic action right now to curb the climate crisis, to keep fossil fuels in the ground, can still ward off the worst case scenario. So we're talking hundreds of millions of lives at stake. We're talking trying to stop entire island nations from being swallowed into the sea.
Right.
So there's still a lot we can do. I think that the reason it's important to look back at this history is because at the very least, we need to learn a harrowing lesson from what the past 20 years have looked like.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I really appreciate your emphasis, all the points you made, Sarah Lazare. But I do want to look back a little bit more in the interests of kind of, as you did in your piece, setting the ground for what we should do going forward. I mean, you mentioned the WTO protests, which it's funny, I was thinking about them just yesterday, and I was thinking about the role of the Democratic Party in all this. I mean, I'm going to stipulate, unless you disagree, that, you know, the Republican Party is just, talk about, you know, nihilistic, you know, just, well, they're not even nihilistic. They're just, you know, a corrupt force. But the Democratic Party, I think, needs to be called out somewhat in this, because it's important for people to understand what the task before us is. For example, in the WTO protests, I remember then President Bill Clinton saying, oh, you know, talking very warmly and sympathetically, well, I sympathize with their goals. And that seems to be the sort of liberal, a lot of times, posture towards critical issues like these as well. I sympathize with you and I get where you kids, quote unquote, are coming from, but then offering the most minimal, if any, responses, almost in trying to inoculate people against the urgency, feeling the urgency of the need. And then, as you say, 9/11 came along, and it's worth reminding ourselves that nearly every Democrat on the Hill voted for the invasion of Iraq, for example, and that whatever you call it, the global war on terror, although the name metamorphosed a little bit, continued through the Bush and Obama administrations and so on. So, and the reason why I bring this all up is not to bear grudges or or divide or any of those things, but because I think it's important, but I love your thoughts on this. I think it's important for us to be sensitive to not being placated or humored or dismissed, but to keep continuing to carry the message that this is a massive crisis and an emergency that needs to be treated. And now, do you get the nuance or difference I'm trying to communicate?
Yeah, I think I do. You know, I think that not being placated and maintaining really big demands in the face of Democrats rhetorically saying they support you is especially important during the climate crisis. The Trump administration did so much harm. It was a denialist administration. There's a real impulse that we have to be careful of, which is a feeling of relief that the Biden administration at least acknowledges climate change is a real thing. However, I think that what we're seeing from the leadership of the Democratic Party is this incredible gulf between, on the one hand, their statements that climate change is an existential crisis, but then on the other hand, their approach to policy, which treats climate change as though it were not an existential crisis. It's very confusing. It sort of creates a kind of whiplash where we're being told that that Democrats agree that all of human society is at stake, but then they're not acting as though that were the case.
Right.
And that gulf is kind of like the essence of neoliberalism, where you witness the suffering, you acknowledge a problem, but then you don't go after the people or players that you need to in order to address the problem. So I think now is an incredibly important time to demand robust action and also demand that the U.S. stop doing harm that's making the climate crisis worse. I mean, the thing I keep thinking about is, the Biden administration sort of stance right now, which is an increasingly aggressive posture towards China.
Right.
In my mind, U.S. policy towards China is climate policy, because there is no feasible way that we can curb the climate crisis without the U.S. and China working together to do that. The U.S. is the biggest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. China is the biggest overall emitter. China's population is bigger than the U.S.'s.
Right.
There's no feasible way to curb the climate crisis without the U.S. and China working together. But when the U.S. does this confrontational posture towards China, maybe Lindsay Kosharian mentioned this to you recently when she was on your show, but we're seeing U.S. posturing towards China being used to justify a bigger military budget,
Right.
overall militarization. That's the opposite of what we need, which is cooperation to address a shared global crisis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Sarah. And in fact, it's an ongoing topic on this program, the new Cold War and the escalation of tensions. And it seems to me, it seems to me, my dad was a professional magician at one point. It seems to me what magicians call misdirection, right? Where if they want to pretend to pull a playing card out of your ear, they distract you with the other hand, so you're looking there while they palm the card and blah, blah, blah. And it seems to me that the misdirection, among other things, of escalating tensions with China helps to keep the current, what Eisenhower called military-industrial complex, in place and growing, while distracting us from what I consider to be the radical changes we need to make. And the reason why, it sounds like we're on the same page. The reason, there's a part of me that would have been very, very happy to see what the Democrats in Congress and the Biden administration are doing, because it's much better than what we had before. But I can't let go of what seems to me like the fundamental reality that we don't just need to treat climate change as an emergency, but addressing it means changing a great deal about our way of life, about our economy, about our foreign policy, about a million things. That we cannot go on this sort of fossil fuel and energy spree, or this profit-taking spree, while the planet is, literally burning, and while we have a choice of multiple futures, some of which are far worse than others. So I think that's consistent with your message in this piece, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to beat back the power of capital and beat back the power of U.S. militarism to address the climate crisis. I mean, one of the more hopeful things about the moment we're living in is that there is a resurgent left in this country, and that left is thinking and working very hard to try to figure out what it would actually take to curb the climate crisis. People are talking about things like a just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry to make sure that no one is sort of discarded or seen as sacrificial to a great big transformation. People are talking about public ownership of utilities for the purpose of decarbonizing them. There are people demanding that we shut down the fossil fuel industry. Really, there's no way to tackle climate change without going head to head with that industry. The IPCC report is very stark. It says that you cannot keep extracting fossil fuels and that this extraction needs to stop right now. And if you believe in science, then you have to do what that says. but that means going up against a very powerful industry, an industry that donates to members of Congress heavily and lobbies those members of Congress heavily as well. And so ultimately, this really requires being willing to counter some of the most powerful capitalist players in our world today. So it's going to take a lot of backbone and a lot of popular movement behind it, which is why that we can't sort of let the, empty promises of Democrats take the wind out of our sails. But, I think that rhetoric is not very meaningful, and material reality is what we need to be paying attention to. And we need to be asking what is the material reality of how policymakers are responding to this crisis.
I'm sure, I was going to say, have you thought about, I'm pretty sure you have. I think we're all thinking about this, but I don't think a day goes by, Sarah Lazare, where I don't think about, okay, how can we concretely move this forward? I mean, the phrase you use in your piece, a sentence you use in your final paragraph, the possibilities for an alternative global orientation are both vast and difficult to know. It's definitely true. There's sort of a kind of Schrodinger's political reality we're living in right now. But what thoughts, it's a big question, maybe not fair, but what have you been thinking about how to concretely move this issue forward? I mean, is it more direct political action in terms of sit-ins and, protests? And is it Extinction Rebellion? Is it Sunrise Movement? Is it Zero Hour, which is mad that I have I think that I have the website, this is the zerohour.com. Is it, how do we, you and I, and everyone who thinks as we do, which I think is a large and growing number of people, how do we concretely change the political and social reality here?
So I don't want to claim that I know the social movement strategies that are going to be successful in this time. Rather, what I want to do is identify one piece of that I do think I can contribute to. So the only way that our society, the United States, knows how to engage in a large-scale mobilization is in the form of war. I would argue that we are learning now that the US military not only cannot solve actual real dangers, the COVID crisis, the pandemic being one of them, but actually makes those dangers far worse. And the idea that it delivers safety or security is a total illusion, and it's just a device to get us to invest more in the military apparatus. So I would argue that whatever solution we push forward, it has to be a civilian solution, and it cannot be carried out through a national security lens, because there's nothing national about the problem of global warming.
Right.
It's a fundamentally global crisis. And so we have to muster a response in this moment that is predicated on global solidarity, that is predicated on notions of radical equality, which is that all of our lives matter the same, regardless of where you happen to live, regardless of national origin. And we have to move forward premised on that notion of solidarity. And that's the only thing that can save us. So the one piece I'm hoping that this article and this conversation can contribute is just really, really pushing us to realize that the solution must be fundamentally civilian and fundamentally internationalist in scope.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Sarah Lazare, before I let you go, I wanted to talk a little bit more about your book, the book Testimony by Peter Lazare and Sarah Lazare. First of all, we talked about that a couple months ago, but remind us, if you would, what the book is and what it's about.
Yeah, so the book is a radical noir. It's a novel. It's about the corporate capture of utilities regulation. It has a climate theme. And it's about the buildup to the Iraq War, and it's about the way public-private partnerships are used to take control away from the people and put it in the hands of the powerful and enrich the powerful. And it's I think it's a pretty fun book. It's a way that my late father and I tried to take on these big issues, but also do it through a compelling story and through interesting characters. We tried to sort of flip the genre of noir on its head by making it about a ragtag team of people who go up against systems of greed and corruption much larger than them. But instead of the sort of one great man story, it's about a bunch of flawed people who are greater than the sum of their parts, and they band together. And you can get it from Strong Arm Press, the publisher. Again, it's called Testimony, and it's by my late father, Peter Lazare, and by me, Sarah Lazare.
It's a really good read. It's a great read. I read the book. I also, as a dad, I love that you completed your dad's work on it, and I love the fact that it's a team of people working together, because so much of our cultural works, right? So much of our fiction, noir in particular, it's the lone alienated individual, right? It's really a very right-wing subliminal messaging in a way. Only a disaffected loner, antisocial loner can, fix the problem. And I love that this is the exact opposite message, that a group of people collaborating can fix the problem. And again, as I say, it's a great read. And by the way, before we get off the topic of Testimony, you got a couple good reviews lately, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. I was really excited. Thomas Hanna did a really lovely review in Jacobin, and Thomas Hanna is actually someone that everyone should check out. He wrote a book called Our Commonwealth, and it's about public ownership of social goods, including utilities. And it was really cool because I actually read his book as part of the research for the novel. And so it was very gratifying that he liked the novel.
Yeah, that's great. And so what are you working on next, or don't you want to say?
Oh, well, in these times, we have a lot of things going on. One of the things that I've been really focused on is trying to look at vaccine apartheid and how global inequalities and corporate greed are leading to horrific situations where almost the entire continent of Africa is being left with meager vaccine supply while the US is debating booster shots. So trying to cover that, trying to stay on top of the negotiations over the war budget for 2022. And then, there's always a lot going on in these times. As a labor publication, we try to stay on top of things that affect working people. And there's never a shortage of stories, both uplifting and deeply depressing, depending if you're talking about worker organizing or exploitation.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you called it the war budget instead of the Orwellian term defense budget. And, a lot of people don't know that the so-called Department of Defense was originally and more appropriately named the Department of War. So thanks for doing that. And the vaccine apartheid story is so critical, so important. And in a way, it's the flip. I don't even want to say it's the flip side. It's deeply connected with the topic we've just been talking about, right? It's another symptom of the same underlying structural disease, I think. But before I let you go, what do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, I think the pandemic is sort of a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis. And we're seeing that private industry is utterly failing to address a global scale crisis, and that you have to beat back the power of capital to be able to make real headway.
Yeah. When I was a kid, there used to be all these science fiction movies about how an alien invasion brought humanity together to face their common threat. And now what we've learned is, they wouldn't do that. Not with capital in charge. They would certain
Yeah.
people would cut deals with the aliens and let the rest of us die. So Sarah Lazare, thanks for writing this great piece. Again, it's at In These Times. The headline is Instead of a War on Terror, quote unquote. Imagine if we spent the last 20 years fighting climate change. And the book on Strong Arm Press by Sarah and Peter Lazare is entitled Testimonies. So Sarah, thanks for writing this piece and book, and thanks for all the good work you do, and thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for all the good work you do. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.